Dr. Gilbert. It's good to see you.
Oh, good to see you.
Doing great, doing great.
Yeah.
So we're delighted that you're joining us here at Palo Alto University. And as you know, we've been doing these trainings for compassion-focused therapy for a while, and it's great that we can have you come visit with us and share a little bit from your wisdom about this work that you do and we're training to do as well. And I was thinking for today, the students have heard a bit about you, but we also have people that will be watching it online. So I'll be doing a little bit of an introduction overview of your background before we begin. Is that okay?
Sure.
Terrific. So I'll share with you, whoever else will be watching, is Paul Gilbert is the head of Mental Health Research Unit, as well as Professor of Clinical Psychology at the University of Derby. He has a degree in economics, as well as a master's in experimental psychology and a PhD in clinical psychology. He holds a diploma in clinical psychology awarded by the British Psychological Association. He is a fellow of the British Society for Contributions to Psychological Knowledge. In 1993, he was the president of the British Association for Cognitive and Behavioral Psychotherapy. And I should probably say that was in 2003 rather than 93. He also served on the Government Depression NICE Guidelines Committee. Paul Gilbert has published and edited 21 books, I think it's more than that by now, over 100 academic papers and 39 book chapters, probably more than that by now. He's currently a serious editor for the Compassionate Approaches to Life Difficulties series. After years of exploring the processes underpinning shame and its role in a variety of psychopathologies, Professor Gilbert's research is exploring the neurophysiology and therapeutic effectiveness of compassion-focused therapy to help advance compassionate approaches to psychological and other human problems. He's established a charity called the Compassionate Mind Foundation. You can find it online, thecompassionatemind.co.uk. The mission statement is promoting well-being through the scientific understanding and application of compassion. In 2011, he was awarded an Order of Chivalry, Most Excellent Order of the British Empire, OBE, by the Queen of England for his work in mental health and the development of the compassion research and practice field. So, part of the exercise is helping you see how you can blush intercontinentally.
You've done it very well.
So we are very delighted to have you here with us. And I will share briefly that in our training so far we have covered some of the basics of CFT, the evolutionary perspective, the ideas about fears of compassion. We've delved a little bit more deeply into the three circles of threat, drive, and soothing, as well as have done some work on mindfulness, attention training, and visualizations. And we thought what might be really interesting today, if you'd be willing to share with us about these dimensions of compassion-focused therapy in regards to how it kind of evolved as a psychophysio-focused approach, and then the relevance of self-soothing and self-compassion, and maybe the relevance of that to cognitive behavioral applications. So, and whatever else really you think that would be useful or interesting or worthwhile for us to kind of learn about in the context of being trained in CFT. So we're excited to hear from you, and let us begin.
Okay, Gilbert, so thank you so much for the extraordinary introduction. So, just to guide me into this, what would you like to hear about first?
Well, it's really about how you might want to share about it. So it's really about how you might want to sequence. I think that the genesis of CFT as a psychophysio approach makes a lot of sense. Next week and afterwards and today, later on, we're going to talk more about self-compassion and how we would relate it to cognitive behavioral work. So we will put our faith and trust in you in terms of how you want to begin to introduce this.
Okay, so let me offer you a little bit of background to how we came to this position. Many, many years ago, we were using cognitive behavior therapy, CBT, and CBT stands for I can't believe this. And what we discovered was that people could generate various alternative thoughts for their negative views or dysfunctional assumptions. But it didn't always help them feel better. So I can remember one day about 25 years ago, I asked one of my depressed patients, so how do you actually hear these thoughts in your mind? When you tell yourself you're not a failure because you've succeeded at this or that, and you have a family that love you, how do you actually hear this in your mind? So she said, well, I try and tell myself, as we've done in cognitive therapy, the evidence is that my life isn't such a failure because I've achieved this and I've achieved that, and that I have a family that love me. But the emotional tone in which she was talking to herself was quite aggressive. It was sort of, come on, look at the evidence. You're doing cognitive therapy. This is black and white thinking. You're overgeneralizing here. So the tone was aggressive. And I discovered that was the case for many patients. There was either an aggressive tone or a neutral tone when they were actually trying to be helpful. So I did a very simple thing. I said, well, let's imagine that you create a very friendly voice in your head. So let's look at these alternative thoughts to your depressive ones, and let's create a really kind, friendly voice. And she looked at me as if I had arrived from Mars. You must be joking. I've never been like that to myself, ever. What will kindness get to me? So it turned out that many of our patients actually couldn't generate what we now call affiliative signals for themselves. They could become logical and even aggressive and self-critical, but being kind to themselves was not on the agenda. Not only that, we discovered that they didn't really respond to the kindness of others. Many of our people often thought that, people were kind to them because they wanted something from them. Many people had been maybe abused as children, and whenever people were kind to them, it was always because they wanted to do something bad to them. So being open to the kindness of others and being kind to themselves, being compassionate to themselves, wasn't on the agenda. So that was kind of interesting. That was the really first part of the story. The second part of the story was recognizing just how important affiliative emotions are for the regulation of threat. Now, Yola has probably told you that if you look at the way the brain has evolved, it's a what we call a very tricky brain. And the reason for this is because we have some very old emotional and motivational systems that go way, way back, hundreds and hundreds of millions of years. And if you look at some of the emotions and motives of, say, your family pet, like your Labrador, they, like you, are interested in respect. They, like you, are interested in sex. They, like you, care for their offspring. They, like you, form relationships with other dogs and so on. So many of our basic motives and emotions are very, very old. But we have what we call a new brain. What we mean by that is that about 2 million years ago, maybe a little more, a little less, humans, or pre-humans, began to get smart. They became clever. And the consequence of that is that we have a mind which is capable of stimulating a lot of these basic emotional motivational systems simply through the way in which we think and imagine. Now, Yoram has probably told you that the example we often give is imagine a zebra running away from a lion. As soon as the zebra has got away, so there is no stimulus in the visual field, no stimulus in the auditory field, no stimulus in the olfactory field. There's nothing stimulating the threat system. The zebra will calm down quite quickly. But for humans, the stimulus is carried inside. So if they were to escape from a lion, they would actually feel relief, of course, but then they would start to imagine. Can you imagine what would have happened if I'd got caught? Can you imagine being eaten alive? Oh my God, it's terrible. And suppose tomorrow there are 2 lions, what am I going to do then? And so on. So humans keep the stimulus within them through their process of rumination and imagination. And it's important to recognize that the way in which we think, the way in which we imagine the things that we ruminate on, have very powerful physiological effects on the body. This is very, very easily demonstrated. For example, if you lay in bed and you are going over a holiday that you're about to go on, and you spent a lot of money on this holiday, you're really looking forward to it, you'll probably feel a little bit excited in the body. Or maybe you're about to get married to somebody you really love. You'll feel a bit excited in the body. But supposing you're laying in bed thinking of an argument that you just had, and how you want to go back to see that person tomorrow and tell them exactly what you think, that rumination will create a very different pattern in your body. Or you're having, say, erotic or naughty fantasies. That will stimulate your pituitary to release hormones which will give you sexual arousal. Now, the point of these stories is recognizing that our new brain is capable of playing old brain like a piano, really. So we have to be very, very cautious and very careful about the processes that we are focusing on in our minds. How do we ruminate? What are we paying attention to? So that's the second part of the story. The third part of the story is that we are a mammal, and mammals have live birth. And as a result of having live birth, parents keep their children close to them and facilitate a process of soothing and calming through bodily contact, stroking, cuddling, and so on. Now, this is extremely important for the developing infant. And it turns out that mammals have capacities for being soothed by the caring of others. In other words, there's no point in evolving caring if the one cared for didn't respond in some way to being cared for. And so it turns out that there is a special system in the brain which is very responsive to signals of caring, signals of friendliness, signals of affection. And Joachim has probably told you that this system is linked to hormones like oxytocin, endorphins, and is linked to the vagal parasympathetic nervous system. So when children are distressed, they will immediately return to the parent, who will then be able to calm that stress. So over many millions of years, mammals have evolved to have their threat systems, distress systems, regulated through affiliative signals. Receiving affiliative signals has a very major impact on the threat system. Not only that, but we know that oxytocin, which is a very important hormone for affiliative behavior, has very direct effects in the amygdala, which is, of course, your threat system. About 70% of the amygdala is orientated to threat processing. So your brain is set up to be regulated through affiliative relating. So that means then that if you're not able to be open to the affiliative signals of others, or if you're living in environments where others are very critical of you, or you're very socially isolated, or you're very critical of yourself, what it means is that you're not getting much stimulation through the affiliative system, and therefore your capacity to regulate threat will be severely disrupted. So compassion-focused therapy really addresses that issue too. So what we try to do is stimulate capacities for affiliative processing. But that's only one aspect of it. What do we mean by compassion? Well, compassion has many, many definitions, but the one that we use is the Mahayana definition, Buddhist definition, which has been around for many thousands of years, and is the typical definition that's used in English-speaking dictionaries. The word compassion itself can be problematic in other languages, such as French. In French, compassion, the word compassion, is close to pity. Well, that's not what we mean by compassion. So what do we mean by compassion? Well, we mean sensitivity to the suffering or distress in self and others, with a commitment to try to alleviate and prevent it. So that has two basic psychologies. But before I say what they are, notice that that's exactly what the attachment system is about. So the parent is sensitive to any threat or harm to the child and is orientated to try to alleviate and prevent it. That's what a good parent does, if you think about it. So there's quite a lot in the psychology of compassion which mimics or overlaps good parenting in many ways. So let's go back to the definition then. And this isn't my definition. This is a definition which has been around more or less for thousands of years. This is a general view about what compassion is. Sensitivity, paying attention, noticing, engaging with, rather than turning away, ignoring, or not bothering. So paying attention to suffering, distress, in self and others. That's the first psychology. And then the second psychology is this capacity for alleviation and prevention. Now, that is, for humans, the second psychology is kind of very interesting, because what it means is we have to be prepared to put effort into acquiring the wisdom and the skills to know what to do. So motivation isn't enough for compassion. If you see somebody falling into a fast-flowing river, and you think to myself, oh my gosh, I must jump in and save them, that's a very compassionate intention. But if halfway through your jump you remember, I can't swim, then it turns out to be not very wise. And so we end up with two dead people rather than one. So what is this wisdom then? How do we acquire the wisdom to know how to alleviate and prevent suffering? Well, that's of course partly where the psychology comes in. Because the wisdom is based upon understanding the mind, understanding what you're up against. So the first thing is recognizing what we're up against is a very tricky brain. We're up against a brain that's not that well put together, to be honest with you. We're up against a brain that can do some pretty awful things. So unregulated, the brain will give you the kinds of things that are going on in Syria right now. So the human brain can respond very much to the social circumstances in which it lives. We often say, as you often will know, that if me here, sitting here in UK, had been kidnapped into a violent drug gang somewhere, South America, China or London or somewhere, because the drug baron wanted to have a son, I was kidnapped as a 3-day-old baby, and I had been brought up in a violent drug gang, this version of Paul Gilbert talking to you tonight would not exist. The one that would exist would be a violent, aggressive male, because 80% of young males who grew up in those environments, that